Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Sage from Terra Nova Acres.
And I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today's podcast topic is going to be no-till and no-dig gardening. But before we get into that, why don't you tell me a little bit about your week?
So we had Taylor's dad here visiting for the weekend, so it was kind of a chill weekend. We didn't film anything, which was actually really relaxing. Like, I had forgotten what it felt like to go do things outside and not have to bring the camera, because I do it every single time. We got like 5 loads of mulch delivered for free. They just showed up and they were like, hey, you still want mulch? And I was like, sure. And then they kept coming back. It was the best. So it smells like fresh mulch outside, and it was a rainy weekend, so we really honestly didn't do a whole lot. I kind of puttered around the garden, mulched some things, and just hung out with Taylor's dad. So they dropped off like the chunky mulch. I think some of it's cedar, some of it's not. They dropped off like 4 loads of the really chunky mulch for like pathways and stuff, but then they dropped off a really big load of stump grind, which is like really fine ground, soft mulch. So I mulched all of our garlic with that. Like, I literally pulled the straw off the garlic and re-mulched it with that stuff because it's just beautiful. It smells so good. It looks really good because it's like dark brown. Very, very happy about that. I'm going to try and mulch everything with that.
You got that fancy mulch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Free.
Did you pay them in eggs this time?
I didn't, because I didn't know they were going to keep coming back. They literally came back until it was dark outside.
Wow.
Like, the last load they dropped off, it was dark out.
That reminds me, I got one of those letters in the mail that said that an arborist is going to come through the area, and I told myself that I should actually follow up with them this time. It's a reminder. We'll see if I actually do it. I kind of doubt it, but I have gone through my mulch pile, and I need a new mulch source.
Are you going to give them a call? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, you should do that.
What did I say?
You said follow up with them.
Okay.
I didn't know if you meant like flag them down while they're in the area. Like, they're driving by.
Hey!
With how much I hate calling people, I would rather do that. To be fair. What did you do this week?
You know, I've mostly just been trying to keep up with all the baby animals. I have the 2 ram lambs that I'm still bottle feeding 3 times a day. And I have this livestock guardian dog puppy that I'm trying to strike a good balance of, letting her be a puppy and doing puppy things and normal dog training, but then also getting her to bond with the other animals like the sheep. But in order to do that, because they're so big, I have to be there to supervise and make sure that everyone's getting along and nobody's going to get hurt. So it's a lot, but also I don't feel like I'm really accomplishing that much because I'm just, standing in the garden watching a puppy run around, even though that is what I need to do. So mostly it's just, keeping up with the baby animals. But I did finally put WD-40 on my front door hinges, and that's one of those things that it like makes my brain hurt every time I open the front door, and I just get irrationally angry, and I think, oh my god, I need to deal with that. And I hear that like 20 times a day because I'm always going in and out. And I finally got around to doing it. I'm so happy. I'm so happy.
It's kind of crazy how big of a difference little things like that make. I avoid things. I can't think of any off the top of my head right now, but I avoid little things like that constantly. I'm like, okay, I need to do that soon. Never get to it. And it's weird how much it bothers you. It
right,
gets
because
to me.
we both have 100 things on our to-do list, and putting WD-40 on the squeaky door hinges is just not a priority most of the time. But I somehow for some reason, hit the perfect circumstance for me to be like, all right, I'm done with it. I'm getting the WD-40 can. Moving on to today's topic, let's start by actually defining these terms. What does no-till mean? What does no-dig mean? No-till refers to gardening methods where you are not taking a tiller to the soil to prepare your beds, which is a little bit different from no-dig.
And no-dig is having no disturbance of the ground whatsoever, but you're kind of just layering materials on top of the ground.
And before we get too far into the conversation of no-dig and no-till, I think it's important to highlight why we as human beings started to till ground as we started to cultivate things. Primarily, there are a few different reasons, but mostly we started tilling because it was favorable for us to go in and disturb the ground in order to take out any vegetation that was already there, so that whatever we were planting at the time, whether that's grain or corn or kale, what have you, would have more of an advantage. It wouldn't get crowded out by the plants that were already in the ground.
And another reason that we started doing it in the first place was just to simply aerate the soil. It was also a way that you could integrate fertilizer into the soil, whether that be chemical or natural fertilizers like compost and what else is natural? Wood ash, things like that. Quickly mixes them into the soil.
But tilling comes with drawbacks. One of the main drawbacks is that it destroys the soil structure. When we're talking about soil and you're looking at the really, the tiniest units of it, you call that a soil pedon. And when we tear apart, basically pulverize the soil pedons, that actually ends up resulting in more compaction over time. Running a tiller over soil can create a layer of compacted soil in the subsurface that's not necessarily obvious at the surface. At the surface, it might be fluffy, it might look wonderful and very friendly to cultivation, but that actually ends up inhibiting drainage, which means that you are going to get standing water in your soil because it's sitting on top of that compacted layer that you can't see. It's also going to result in more runoff out of the area that you're attempting to cultivate, which is going to carry away the things that you actually want to keep in the soil, like nutrients.
Because tilling kind of breaks up the root structure of the soil and the roots that are in place holding it in place, it makes it much more easily eroded, which you can kind of mitigate that with the use of mulch, but you can't completely replace how well the roots are going to hold that soil in place. As you get more runoff, the effects of this whole erosion situation are just going to get worse and worse. And the reason that matters is because all of that topsoil is where the most nutrients in the soil lie, where your garden plants are drawing a lot of their food from. So all that good stuff is just washing away. And that's going to just overall cause a lot of health issues for your soil. And then as that water runs off of your soil, it's collecting all that good stuff that you want to keep in your soil. And down the line, that causes water quality issues in creeks, streams, water systems in general.
And it not only disrupts the soil structure itself, but it also disrupts the soil microbiome, which is something that we don't often think about because we don't really see it. We think about worms, maybe, but the things that really benefit plants, like the fungal hyphae, we don't normally see that in our soil, and we don't think about that getting disrupted when we go in and take a tiller and essentially put all of that soil through a blender.
So if you were to take a soil sample and you go down a little bit, there are different levels that you're going to see, different layers of soils. They're made of different things. So when you're tilling, you're mixing all of that together, basically, which dilutes the topsoil. Naturally, you're going to see about a few inches of topsoil depending on where you're located in the world. It's going to be different for everyone, but topsoil is a very organic, heavy, loamy, and dark soil. It's the rich stuff. It's got all that good stuff in it. So underneath that is going to be a less nutrient-dense subsoil. And where we are in the southeast, that's usually clay. For me, a lot of our property is really compact and really deficient in that topsoil layer. So it's all compact clay for the most part. But on average, you'll find probably a few inches of topsoil.
There are some places that naturally have really deep topsoil profiles, like in the Midwest, you'll see mollisols, and that's 6+ inches of topsoil. That's not normal. For most of us, we're lucky if we have a couple inches. And then, even though we started tilling mostly to combat weeds, tilling actually, in the long term, ends up stirring up the natural seed bank of weeds and results in more weeds that you're going to have to contend with throughout not only the season, but also throughout the years as you continue to cultivate that garden space. And that's particularly because that's what weeds are designed to do. Weeds are designed to go in and colonize areas where it's recently been disturbed. That is their biological niche. And if you're curious about all of these claims that we're making, all of these points that we're making, we will include the resources that we use to back all that information up. They are from Oregon State University and from, I believe, Indiana State University as well. So if you're curious, go check out those resources.
So there are obviously a lot of drawbacks to tilling, and I think the both of us we lean towards no dig, no till in our gardens, but there are some drawbacks to not tilling, not digging in your garden beds as well. So let's go through some of those now. The first drawback that we are going to go over is it takes a lot more effort and time to kill the existing vegetation and grass that's there when you're not tilling and you're not digging.
And sometimes as gardeners, we will even intentionally cultivate other vegetation in our garden spaces, like cover crops, for example, buckwheat. And when you do till, you're able to till that material in so that it fertilizes what's going in there next. But obviously, if you're not digging, if you're not tilling, you can't do that as easily.
So in specific regards to using something like a broad fork versus a tiller, using a broad fork is going to take a lot more effort on your part, manual labor-wise. Using a tiller, it's definitely a workout. At least for me, it was a workout, but I feel like it's still no comparison to actually just like having to shove a broad fork in the ground and like lift up manually. And then it's also going to take you a lot more effort to work in any sort of chemical or natural fertilizers, whether you're adding compost and you're trying to like mix it in manually, or if you're just sprinkling on any sort of chemical fertilizer and you want to mix it in, you're going to have to do that manually. With compost, though, there's nothing wrong with just top dressing and literally throwing it on top of your beds and calling it good. A lot of the times with chemical fertilizers and whatnot, you want to mix those in. I personally just like to sprinkle things on and call it good, but, to each their own.
And then just in general, doing things no dig style, doing things no till style is going to take a little bit more time. The point of tilling usually is to solve these soil texture issues or weed issues in the short term. And so it's just going to take some time for the soil to go through these, no dig, no till, what I would call therapeutic practices, if you're treating your garden soil right, to do things like relieve compaction or to break up clay. That's not going to be an immediate process like it would be with a tiller. Same thing with building nutrient-rich soil. If you had the money to get just a ton of compost and till that in, that would be a pretty immediate solution, but it's just a little bit different when you're not wanting to disturb the soil to that extent. And also, it takes a while to exhaust the weed seed bank. Yes, tilling does set you up to give weeds the perfect environment to sprout, but weeds are also pretty good at sprouting no matter what. And so it's going to take years of that investment for you to really see those sorts of payoffs.
I feel like we should probably pause and just kind of define what we mean by weed. The definition of a weed is something that's growing where you don't want it to be growing. So when we say weed seeds can be dormant or live in the underground for a really long time, that can really be any seed that you don't want to grow in your garden bed. So I just wanted to clarify that before we get too far into this and you guys are like, what are they talking about? Which weeds?
And obviously, there are more than just drawbacks to these methods. Otherwise, we wouldn't do them. So let's talk a little bit about the pros, not just the cons. As far as no-till, no-dig, these methods are really, really good for building your soil topsoil and building your soil health because they are actually retaining all of that good organic matter because they are maintaining the structure of that soil a little bit better.
Another positive of the no-till, no-dig garden bed styles is that they sequester carbon. Soil is one of our main carbon sinks on the planet. When you think about it, that organic matter obviously contains a lot of carbon. So building topsoil means that you're retaining a lot of organic matter, which means you're retaining carbon and you're locking that carbon into the soil. And the way I think about that in gardening terms, I guess, is the use of peat. I think that that's kind of why people are turning or have turned away from using peat in garden soils and whatnot, is because peat is like one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world, is it not? Am I wrong? I feel like that's like that was a big thing a couple of years ago that I read about. It says they store twice as much carbon than all the world's forests.
Jeez.
Which is wild. I don't know. That's a random fact that was in my brain.
And then, like we've mentioned before, over time, there is lower weed pressure in the long term because you're not disturbing that soil, you're not reinvigorating that weed seed bank. And then because you're not tilling it, you are leaving the soil structure better intact, even if you are digging a little bit, doing things like broadforking, which means that you're going to have better drainage long term and less erosion.
The last thing on our list is that it doesn't disturb, or it very minimally disturbs, depending on if you're doing no-till or no-dig, the soil ecosystem.
Now let's get into a little bit more of the specifics of what these methods look like and what the differences are between them. Starting with the no-till methods, so these are not quite no-dig, but they're also not tilling. They're somewhere in between. So you're still disturbing the soil just a little bit, but it's less invasive than going in and tilling that soil would be. The first and probably the most popular is broadforking. So you are sticking, it's called a broad fork for a reason. It's basically a really big fork. You're sticking that fork in the soil, you're working it down approximately 6 to 8 inches, and then you're pulling back on it, which is going to allow you to aerate that soil. It's going to allow you to break up some of that compaction and make it a little easier to cultivate. But the benefit of broad forking versus tilling is that you are not mixing the soil profiles together. So the topsoil stays on top and it doesn't dilute it in the same way that tilling would truly blend all of that material from about 6 to 8 inches together.
The second no-till method is tilthing, and I'm going to spell that because if you're just listening, it might just sound like tilling. It's tilthing, tilthing. I guess I would kind of consider this minorly tilling. It only disturbs the top couple inches of soil instead of super deep down like 8 to 10 inches like a tiller would. It minimizes damage to the soil structure and the overall microbiome because you're only disturbing that top few inches. And this is what I'm doing in my no-till beds this year, the ones that I'm actually disturbing. I guess I would call it tilthing with my hoe or rake.
They make really expensive pieces of equipment called tilthers, but you don't have to have a tilther. You can do it with whatever piece of equipment you have, whether that's a garden rake, a garden hoe, whatever.
But there are a handful more of no-dig specific methods that we're going to go through now. So the first one that we're going to go over is hugelkultur, and that is a German word, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. And it basically means hill culture, and you're basically making a mound. And the way that you're doing that is you're starting with plain ground, whatever ground you got there, can keep the grass on it and everything. You're going to lay down preferably rotten tree trunks or stumps or really large, thick branches. You can use freshly cut ones too. It's just going to take longer for them to break down if you use them. And Then on top of that, you're going to layer smaller branches, twigs, any just random chunks of wood you can find. Again, any of the wood that you use, it's best to use partially rotten if you can. And then on top of that, you're going to layer twigs, even smaller twigs, leaves, any garden debris. You can use grass clippings, anything that's going to just bulk up your bed a little bit. And then on top of that, you want to add some sort of compost, and that can be manure. It can be subsoil. I've seen people do that. Some people will, before they start the bed, they will cut out the sod that's going underneath it, and they will flip it upside down and layer that on this fourth layer so the dirt is facing up. And then you kind of want to just tuck all of that into those layers. So you're filling in as many gaps as possible. And then the very, very top layer, you want to add more compost, you want to add topsoil, and then you want to make sure that you mulch it. Whether you're using grass, straw, actual like wood chip mulch, it doesn't matter, but you want to make sure that you mulch it so that it holds its moisture. And that's basically the gist of it. You can kind of use whatever materials you have on hand. I personally use rotten wood, leaves. I just tuck all the leaves in there. I had topsoil and then some compost to top it off with straw on top. The first year that you do it, you want to plant shallow rooted things because you're wanting the wood in this to break down. And that over time, as it breaks down, it's going to just keep feeding your soil. So it's going to be like a really, really rich, well-fed garden bed.
Yeah, it's kind of self-fertilizing, which is cool. And then I also appreciate that when you do things hugelkultur style, you can increase your growing space because it's, basically this hill instead of just the flat ground. And so it's more surface area to grow in, which can be cool. And I like this method, but I haven't actually tried this method before.
Yeah, I think initially that's part of why they did it that way, because you can make them as tall as you want. Some people will make them like almost vertical, which is really cool to see. I've never seen one of them in person. Ours is more of like a low mound. It's probably 2 feet tall, but it's really wide and it holds heat well. So things really they last longer into the winter and they start growing sooner in the spring. I personally have a bunch of perennials planted in mine. So it's kind of like it's its own little mini food forest almost that I don't have to worry about. One thing about these though is as that wood breaks down underneath, they are going to sort of collapse. So they drop lower and lower each year. So you kind of, I suppose you could just keep adding materials on top if you wanted them to stay hills, but over time they are going to drop down and flatten out a little bit.
Probably one of the most popular no-dig methods that I see, and it might be people not even necessarily intending to do no-dig, but it ends up being that way, is raised beds. And when it comes to raised beds, a big question is how you fill it. You can borrow from a lot of the same things that Mickayla just talked about with hugelkultur. I know a lot of people, myself included, tend to fill their raised beds starting with, partially rotted trunks or branches, twigs, whatever you have. And then leaves are another great thing, or any sort of grass clippings, rotting hay, rotting straw, any kind of organic matter like that is fantastic because it helps you save money on the soil that you would otherwise be filling it with. But if you have the money to go ahead and fill all those beds with topsoil and or compost, that's probably the ideal scenario. But not everyone can do that. I know I definitely didn't do that for mine. And raised beds can be any variety of heights. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. Building raised beds does tend to be a little bit more costly than most other gardening styles or garden infrastructure in general, but it is more aesthetic, and especially if you, for some reason, aren't comfortable digging into your soil because there could be buried utilities underneath, or maybe you have a really shallow soil profile and there just isn't much to garden in. Raised beds are a really, really good way to get started in it and get started with some good soil.
So the next one is one that I am trying out for the first time this year, but I've heard really great things about this one, and that is Ruth Stout. And Ruth Stout is obviously a person. This is her method of gardening. And it's basically just mulching a really, really thick layer on top of the soil and growing inside of that mulch. So I think the most popular thing you'll see it done with is potatoes, because that just seems Ruth Stout potatoes. If you search Ruth Stout, potatoes come up. That's what we're trying it with this year. So basically, you can put cardboard down on top of the ground first, but I didn't do that. It's not necessary for this method. And you just want to do like a solid foot of whatever mulch you're using. Particularly with Ruth Stout, it's either hay or straw usually. I'm using straw. A lot of the times it will be rotten hay or straw from like animal bedding, or wasted hay from your goats or whatever animal. So it's putting that wasted product to use again, and it fertilizes your soil, it keeps the weeds at bay, and it just works really, really well. The gist of the Ruth Stout method is it's no till, it's no dig, it's supposed to be no water because it holds all that moisture in a really thick layer of mulch. It's no weed because nothing can really grow through a foot of straw. Well, there are a couple things, but and then you don't need to compost it because your rotten straw or hay is feeding your whatever you have planted in there. With potatoes in particular, the reason we're trying it is because we don't have to dig them out of our hard clay soil this year. So that's another benefit, and that's why a lot of people use it for potatoes, is so you don't have to dig down and actually like find the potatoes in the dirt. You can just kind of pull the hay or the straw away, and they're all your treasure is waiting for you.
Question about that. I've never tried Ruth Stout method for anything. Are there things that you should not try to grow using that? I'm picturing things like carrots that, I mean, based on my understanding of what it sounds like, there are things that would be good for that and things that might not be.
I would probably not try and grow direct sown things in it, like tiny seeds, because they're just going to get lost in it. So if you're trying to sow carrots in it, I don't feel like that would work very well unless you mulched it after the fact. But I think the point of Ruth Stout is you're planting it in that really thick mulch. You're not planting it in the ground below it. So with carrots, I think the seeds would just get lost in there and then smothered out. I think you could probably do maybe like melons and squash, pumpkins in it if you like let them start growing before you mulched it really thickly. Like if you did a few inches of mulch, let them start growing and then kind of piled it on as they grew. But again, it's my first year doing it, so I don't have too much experience with it yet.
And another really popular method, something that would probably be, dare I say, the easiest way to get into no-dig gardening would be just sheet mulching. You can do this by laying cardboard down and covering it with any sort of mulch that you want to use, but I would recommend using wood mulch just because it's a little heavier, it lasts a little bit longer. The benefit of this is, especially with the cardboard, that's going to get rid of any vegetation that was already there, except for some stuff like crabgrass is going to be pretty persistent, but it's going to get rid of most of the vegetation that you have there, and then you can manage what does grow back by other weeding methods. But it's going to give you a really big head start on that garden space. If you're looking to do this, I also highly recommend setting it up in the off season, doing it in, the colder months, January, February, March, even into April, depending on where you are. That's going to give the cardboard time to kill the grass off. That's going to give the mulch time to sit in place and start making some really, really lovely soil for you to garden in. You can still use this if you're ready to garden. It's just probably going to be a little bit less effective with managing the vegetation that's already there, because if you're digging into it to get your garden plants in there, it's going to create a pathway for some of those weeds to pop up.
The first two methods that we said, hugelkultur and raised beds, those are going to be the two that you are able to plant in immediately and be able to get good results. These last three, which are Ruth Stout, sheet mulching, or lasagna gardening, whatever you want to call it. And this last one is Back to Eden. You're going to want to do all of those in the winter and give them a few months to kind of get themselves in order before you try and plant things in them. Just because, I guess I should have said this before, the Ruth Stout, the hay and straw, those can have weed seeds in them that will grow more hay and straw. And so you want to give those time to kind of die off before you try and plant anything in it. But this next one, Back to Eden, is very similar to both Ruth Stout and sheet mulching, but it's basically a layer of cardboard, and then you're going to put compost on top, and then you're going to put mulch on top of that. And this one is typically actual mulch, like wood mulch. And that's pretty much it. It's really simple.
From what I understand of Back to Eden gardening specifically, at least as far as I've heard it from Paul Gauchi, because it's the only person that I know of who does this, or that I've, sought off that information from. It's supposed to be like at least 3 inches or something crazy of wood chip mulch, right?
So everything that I've seen, the ridiculous part about Back to Eden to me is that you're supposed to do like 8 to 12 inches of compost and then a few inches of mulch. So these
Wow.
get really expensive really fast if you're trying to garden on the scale that Sage and I are. That's why I usually do 2 to 3 inches of compost, whatever I'm feeling like rationing that day, out of my compost pile. And then I will do a layer of mulch and just kind of add it as needed. But again, this is something you're going to want to let sit for a while so that the weed seeds can kind of die off and you can manage the weeds in the bed before you try and plant anything in it. But yeah, obviously having a heavier mulch is going to help that. Obviously, these no-till and no-dig methods are going to help suppress the weeds a little bit better than tilling will. But in my case, and from what I've seen in stuff I've researched, obviously some weeds are going to get through. In particularly for me, it's rhizomus. It's grass with rhizomes that kind of digs under and it breaks through the cardboard and however thick that mulch layer is. We have Bermuda grass that kind of crawls over the top, and that's also an issue. And then I can speak to Ruth Stout in particular, quack grass is what it's called. That's a huge problem for that because that grows right through. And that's like one of the only things that will grow through the Ruth Stout method.
Lucky you.
So we wanted to tell you guys some different ways that you can manage weeds with no-till methods because obviously it's still going to be somewhat of an issue.
Yeah, no matter how you garden, you're going to deal with some weeds. If you have animals on your property, they are a great way to manage weeds. I know I have my sheep and my chickens in my garden right now. They are strategically fenced out of specific areas, like my fruit trees and my berry bushes, but the sheep were great about taking out some grass that I've actually had in the garden since it's been turned into a garden because I couldn't get to it and the chickens couldn't do as much damage, but the sheep ate the grass down to the nubs and I pour the chicken feed right on top of those nubs that are left and the chickens are working on taking it out. The chickens are also working on all of these first signs of green life that are all weeds that are popping up in my garden. And even though they can be destructive in the wrong situations, when when they're used for the right situations, it's actually really handy. So animals are doing my garden prep for me right now.
That's so nice. We had papaya on our garden in the tractor before Red and Steven took him, and now I'm like, well, who's gonna finish my garden prep now? Now I have to do it. Another way that we deal with weeds in the garden and just kind of trying to keep the garden beds a little bit less likely to grow the weeds over spring is tarping all of them. Silage tarps are the best way to do this because they have a white side and a black side, and you can kind of choose which one you want to use. If you want to smother the weeds that are there out, you can put the black side up and it will like solarize them. It will overheat all of them and it will kill everything that's in there. We got really lucky, and with all of the trash on our property, in our little shed, we found an entire roll of silage tarp. So we didn't have to buy it, and it covers most of our garden beds. I've gone through the whole roll of it now, and I think it covers all but like 3 of our beds, which is really cool. It is really expensive. But yeah, we try to keep that on them all winter, and I think that doing that is the reason that my soil has improved and stayed nice and soft on the top layer after tilling last year, because the beds that we didn't cover up that grew weeds in them, they're just like that dry, crumbly clay still, but the beds I had covered up are like nice and soft and fluffy and still have a lot of their compost and organic matter that I added last year, which I'm very happy about that.
Similar to a silage tarp, but a little bit different, you can also use landscape fabric or weed barrier. It's supposed to be permeable to water, and the idea is that you lay it on top of your soil. You can add a layer of other mulch on top of it if you want to, but it's really intended to be lay it down, cut or burn holes where you're planting your plants, and you're done. I have heard not fantastic things about landscape fabric and weed barrier. And from what I've heard, people end up ripping it out. But I could totally see myself, if I were operating on a much larger scale, if it were less homestead and more farm, I could see myself opting for this, especially for establishing new garden areas. I might not keep it long term, but it can be a lifesaver if you are cultivating really huge areas.
Yeah, I think that the key with landscape fabric is realizing that it's meant to be used for a season or 2 and then to be replaced. Because if you think it's going to last 5-10 years, you are mistaken. Things are going to grow through it. It's in the sun. It's going to be brittle. It's going to crack and rip. And it's not meant to be left on the ground, and eventually it's going to deteriorate. That's just what things do when they're sitting in the hot sun, you know? So I think it can be an effective way to do this, but I think you have to realize its limitations. The next way to manage weeds is with a garden hoe. There are a lot of different versions of garden hose. We're not gonna get into that because there are so many different versions of them. I personally have a spade garden hoe, and I really like that because it grabs onto things really well and pulls them out easily. And I can also make like trenches and furrows really well with it. So that's what I prefer to use. The key to this is that you want to do it before you see the weeds growing.
I feel like when it comes to managing weeds with a garden hoe, there's 2 camps. There's people that love it and there's people that hate it. And I am one of the people who hates it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of at the point where it's nice to dig out established weeds. And that's like, for me, that's mostly clumps of grass. So I have not gotten to the point where my beds are weed free enough that I can do it before I see the weeds. It's me like aggressively tearing the existing ones out with them right now. And it works really well for that too. But it really isn't enjoyable to do at the same time. Like, it definitely hurts your back if you have to do it a lot. I prefer mulching. There are a lot of different ways you can mulch your garden, and a few of them that we're going to go over are hay, straw, and wood chips. And I guess another one would be leaf mulch if you wanted to do that. That's a free one. But we're going to start with hay. So hay is easy to find. It's cheap. But you need to be cautious with it because hay is very often sprayed with things so that it can grow. So you want to make sure you're finding an organic or not sprayed source that you can trust. I know we've mentioned this in a previous episode, but another reason that I am hesitant to use hay specifically is it can contain grass seeds. And because of that, it's going to sprout grass in it, and you're going to have to reapply more hay on top of it, which you can totally do. It just goes through a lot of hay. What I like to use in my garden, and we're kind of switching over to this from tilling this year, is straw, because It's usually even cheaper than hay. It's just as easy to find. You might have to travel a little bit to source unsprayed straw, just like you would for hay. But straw is a lot less likely to contain the seeds that hay would because it's just a waste product, basically. So what I do is we use straw for our chicken and duck bedding, and then once the ducks are done with it, we will put the duck bedding directly onto our garden since their compost is cold, and then with the chickens, we'll either let it sit and rot for a while so it's not as hot of compost to put on top of it, and then we'll use it like 6 months later. That's our plan. But for now, we're just using the duck bedding and straight up straw from the bale on the garden. And we have seen a little bit of grass growing in there, but it's really easy to just pull out that grass if you do a thick enough straw or hay layer.
Another great mulch is leaves. You can usually find leaves for free. I know I may or may not have gone through neighborhoods and borrowed their leaves, but every year people are doing yard cleanups and they're putting it out at the end of the road. A lot of cities, Asheville included, have programs where it goes and it gets composted. Basically, it doesn't go to the landfill, but I know some areas it does go to the landfill. And so there is a little bit of risk there because you don't know how people manage their yards if you're getting it from someone else, if you're not able to source that from your own property. So there is technically a cross-contamination potential there, but it's less than with straw or with hay. Another drawback to using leaves as mulch is that they will blow away with the wind. And I say this because I've used leaves as mulch. If I were to do it again, I would probably do something like pour the leaves into a really big trash can and take like a weed eater and put it into the trash can and break up that leaf mulch a little bit, because a leaf is basically kind of a giant sail. And so if you can break up that leaf a little bit, it's going to be less likely to get picked up on the wind. And it'll probably stay a little bit better, as it gets wet, as you're watering your garden and all these other things. So it is a great free resource to use, but honestly, I prefer wood chips. I think wood chips last the longest, they're heavier, they stay in place, and they don't really have those cross-contamination concerns of the others, but they are more expensive and they are so much heavier to move than all the other ones. Moving a bale of hay or straw or a bag of leaves is not that bad, but wheelbarrowing loads of mulch from my driveway all the way up that steep slope to my garden is not easy.
I personally like to use wood chip mulch on perennial areas only, at least so far, because I find it's really, really hard to direct sow. It's not hard, it's a pain in the butt to have to move wood chip mulch out of the way to direct sow things. So just keep that in mind. I don't mind it in perennial areas as much because you're not disturbing that. You're not having to pull it away as constantly. And a lot of the times you're putting seedlings or full grown plants into it, like rosemary or like a mint plant or something. You're putting that plant into the soil. But wood chip mulch on a bed that I'm flipping and I'm sowing seeds, like if I were to put wood chip mulch on a carrot bed, that makes no sense for me. Because I'd have to move it all out of the way and it would just be a pain. So personally, I love wood chip mulch for my pathways and for my perennial beds, and I'm going to put it on top of my hugelkultur bed this year.
That's a really good point. I don't think about that as much because baby greens and carrots are the only things that I direct sow. I transplant everything else. So that's something that I often don't think about, but that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I figure I transplant most of my stuff, but the first year I had an actual garden, I mulched it and I was like, this is the worst thing I've ever done. Like, why did I do this? Because I had to like pick it out of the top layer of soil because I got compacted in there. And then you don't want it to mix into your soil because then it's stealing nitrogen as it breaks down from your seedlings' roots. That's a whole other topic, but yeah, just be cautious of where you put it if you're going to use wood chip mulch. All right, guys, that's all we have for you today, but we do have a free little guide that's going to break down each one of these gardening methods for you. So if you're interested in the layers of all of these and want to try and figure out which one you want to try, we have that linked below in the description.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.